Welcome to All About Impact, the official podcast of Imagine If Insights and Strategy. I'm your host, Susan Petoyan. All About Impact is the only podcast in the world that is exclusively dedicated to the art and science of creating real and positive impact with data, research, and insights. We push ambitious marketers, practitioners, and users of data, research, and insights to create meaningful, tangible, real-world impact with their work. Join us as we bring you diverse perspectives from hand-picked impact champions, incredible cross-disciplinary leaders who are masters at activating insights to transform business and achieve unparalleled success for their teams, organizations, careers, and of course, customers. Now is the time to venture into the world of influence and impact far beyond data and insights. Tune in today and boldly unleash the impact champion in you. And in today's episode, we're going to discuss all things impact with LeTisha Shaw, who is an amazing change agent for subscription-based SaaS companies, specializing in building teams, driving growth strategies, and fostering a culture of curiosity, optimism, and resilience through customer empathy and data-driven storytelling. Welcome, LeTisha.
Thanks for having me, Susan.
It's such an honor, a privilege, and way overdue. I have been wanting to do this, having to have this conversation with you for a long time. As we go into it, LeTisha, I just want to quickly kind of mention a couple of highlights from your background, but I know there's a lot more. And our notes and introduction text in the right places will tell our audience about how brilliant you are and what an amazing career you've had. But today, I want to talk to LeTisha as the director of product marketing at UserTesting. She's been a leader. I'm not going to say how many years, but a leader for a good while in marketing, in growth, specifically in tech, always centered on the customer and strategy. And at the not very least of all of this is the fact that LeTisha has been and continues to be a big champion of change, both within organizations, outside organizations, socially speaking, overall. Welcome, LeTisha. I'm so excited to start this conversation with you.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Awesome. So you and I have talked so much over the years about insights and research and data inside brands, outside brands, and kind of different configurations of relationship, right? And I think the key thing has always been in our conversations has always been what's going to come out of all the work that goes into producing, collecting, kind of executing the data initiative, right? Whatever it is. I think it's a great place to start if we ask, what do we feel like are the common reasons that data initiatives do not kind of succeed? Sometimes they fail to achieve impact within the organizations, within the team, or across the teams. And based on your extensive experience, LeTisha, as a leader in data functions, data spaces, data projects, like massive projects that I know, what do you feel like are the biggest barriers for having impact with a lot of these types of
I'm really glad that you asked this question, Susan, because it gets into a topic that I think a lot of us in the community are thinking about today, which is one, how do you prove ROI on the work that you're doing? And the other is really around how do you achieve or show that impact? And I think there are a lot of reasons why it's really challenging to do that, especially today. I mean, one of the reasons is that we've got so many sources of data available than we did before. I mean, you could actually be really confused on which source you should trust, to what fidelity and what degree. And some sources have more rigor than others, and one have one particular lens versus a different lens. It becomes really difficult to pull all these disparate pieces together and figure out what is the story there and try to tie that together to what the impact is. Another thing that I think makes it really challenging is that sometimes there's this game of telephone that happens. Like by the time you start out and you telling the story of what the impact is for an organization, by the time it actually ends up, and this could happen in very large organizations too, by the time it actually gets to the receiver of the information, the story's actually morphed and changed quite a bit based off of the different lenses that it's gone through, where it's no longer as impactful as it might have been. I think the opposite of that scenario is what I would call more like a black box, which is that there are requests that come into data or research or insights teams without any context. So they're kind of like order takers in a way and not really acting as business partners. And it's more like a input and output sort of a thing. So it's really hard to connect the dots to the people, to the things that matter for the business. I can speak specifically to a project that I worked on at Disney where we were working on a very similar problem, similar challenge, but it was like two different departments going after it in different ways. One area was kind of looking at the market research approach, and another one was working on building a business model to assess impact. And we had to essentially restart the project again to then figure out, okay, well, how do we get the model to tie to the research and the research tied to the model so that these things fit together so that we were actually able to measure the impact that we were looking for. I think it's a hard thing to do. It takes a lot of coordination in order for it to happen. So I'm not surprised that it happened.
You just gave us such a generous, there's so many things in there that I would love to unpack a little bit, right? Starting with just a very mechanical kind of functional variable of there's just so many different sources, such a variety of types of data, different rigors, etc. So that alone is a huge, I'm not going to say a barrier necessarily, but it's a huge hindrance. You have to figure all of that out before you even are ready to have an impact conversation. I feel like that is a given in data, even though data is much more accessible and there's just a lot of it, some say too much of it. We still have standardization issues. We don't have any kind of consistent coding sometimes, organizing, structuring. We spend 80% of our time on processing, let alone thinking about what are we going to do once this process ends and we have some outputs that we're going to look at. I think that's unbelievable. That's still the case.
Yeah, so just speaking to what you're talking about right now, let's assume that everything has been set up so that the research or the experiment is unbiased, which we know is a challenge. So let's assume that happened. We still need people to be able to translate and speak to these different sources of data. Not everybody is multilingual in that sense. So I think that's part of the challenge as well. And then it takes time to get people to talk to each other, to be able to untangle and discern what's actually going on, to then be able to put that story of impact together. And sometimes to be clear, the person on the business side or the decision maker may not be familiar with all of the different methodologies or techniques. So the question is being asked, but then there's still a bit of like translation that has to figure out like what's the best way to go about and get this answer for this person and what's the most efficient way to do that.
It's fascinating because I've been talking about this for a while now. And the more you slow down and break it apart, all the different contributing factors for, I'm not going to say failed impact, but subpar kind of ROI or outcomes that could have been so much more effective and so much more successful, they're not. A lot of this is just, it's there, but I feel like the researcher or the data analytics community doesn't really plan ahead proactively at times. Or if they do, sometimes they miss the big picture because we're so in the weeds. We're so trying to make it work and really trying to crack the technical aspects of what we're doing, as opposed to what you mentioned, which is the translation, the organization, like the activation aspect. And gosh, if it's a large and siloed or changing organization, it feels like that's a whole other endeavor on top of the project itself, right? I know that you and I have worked at large companies like Disney, for example, especially in a category where there's a lot of change. Leaders, stakeholders, the consuming community, the layers of the organization that have to take up this project's outputs and make decisions, kind of change their thinking, whatever, they're not often aligned. They might not have the appetite or the technical skills to understand the methodology, the technical aspects. And I feel like, let me know if you kind of how you feel about this. The larger the organization, the more complex, the more room there is for all these types of variables to come in, especially when it comes to the human side or the organizational psychology side of how do you share this? How do you make sure that everyone hears it in their own language? The finance team, the product team, the marketing team, but you're still bringing them all together with a good story to move them forward, right? So talk to me about that aspect of like how do you organize the community around your insights, the outputs? What have you seen that's kind of interesting that you can share with our audience, either as barriers or as contributing factors when it comes to going from results to people?
Results to
Mind you,
people.
to
Oof.
people, yeah.
Well, I think if you're just trying to go from results to people, that's where things may break down a little bit, because I really see it as it needs to start much further before then. It's almost there's a warming up period where there's an opportunity to bring stakeholders along in the journey. And that kind of starts far before the research kicks off to make sure that they're involved and you're getting the appropriate buy-in and input. And then there's a period where you kind of disappear, right? And things happen in the black box, right? And then something comes out of that. And that's when we get the results. But I think there's several iterations of the results in sharing that then makes the impact more tangible for the organization, because each team has their lens. Like finance is looking at certain things. Marketing is looking at different things. Legal's looking at it from a different perspective. As distribution's looking at it from a different perspective. So the more that you can kind of understand the challenges that they have and the way that they're looking to use the information to incorporate it in their business, I think that's the thing that makes it really tough for the insights team, is you've kind of got to retrofit what you have coming out and make it fit into these other teams so that they can just take it as it is and run with it. Otherwise, it lands on their desk and it's nice information, but they kind of don't know how to take action on it. And I think that's the trick, to get something from the results to the insights to the action part, where you can get to making the impact.
Sometimes we call it an imagine if dead on arrival, right? The wanted, sure, they get it, they like it even. You might see that excitement or a little bit of that enthusiasm, but it just within that meeting or within that day, the kind of the longer term activation process, all of a sudden like goes away. Yeah, we got the results. That's it, right?
But I would say that this challenge exists at smaller companies as well. I've worked at startups like Evernote, and it's a different challenge from that aspect, because you're definitely under-resourced in that sense. There may or may not be an established research team that exists. And so what that means is a lot of times the questions that are being asked are being more like validation types of questions that the team is going after, which means there's not necessarily a balance in looking at some of the explorative research that might take the team in a slightly different direction. And it's a challenge, because you're moving a little bit faster than you may be at some of these other organizations, but yet it still is a challenge.
Absolutely. That's such a great point, because I stated it's more complicated in larger companies, but at smaller companies, you have other complexities, other layers. And I think another variable here is if the internal team, the championing team, the research team, let's say, or the data team, let's say, if they're truly empowered or not, right? You hit on something very in the very beginning, LeTisha. I want to go back to just to dissect that a little bit. And that was the idea of, are they taking orders to produce some outputs, some numbers that are going to go into some template or some business plan or something somewhere, just check them off? Or are they even positioned to talk about impact as a cross-functional team, or as a team at maybe not directly at the table, but at against the walls in the conference room where the tables are, right? So tell me, or talk to me a little bit about that in terms of, that balancing act. And it's complicated. There's so many other kind of contributing factors there. But what has been your observation? Is there a through line that you see in a lot of your experiences when it comes to being a lean forward versus a lean back research or data team?
I think it's about building partnership, and it's actually taking time to slow the conversation down and share information. There's like this assumption that all of the information comes out of the research or the data team or the insights team, right? And that's not necessarily the case. There's, for example, working in marketing and user testing. We collect a lot of information from customers by listening to them. And that's actually very helpful for our data teams to understand, to get more of a perspective of our business, to hear more of the customer that guides some of the research and analyses that they conduct. And that context is really helpful because then when the results come back to the business side, it's actually more meaningful for us. And we're able to take that learning and then translate it into a program that we can implement across the business. So I really see it as it needs to be more of a bi-directional kind of a conversation, not really more of like a one-way feed.
Absolutely. Partnership, collaboration, these are absolutely key. However, when we add that additional layer on top of sometimes the actual technical challenge that the research or the analysis that's supposed to crack is so complex that, again, all these other variables end up being an afterthought at best, right? So I don't know what the solution is to that all the time, other than to bring people who are probably well skilled in kind of the intangibles as well as the technical, or divide, I don't know, maybe hire a different team, a different talent within a team, or to your point, make friends in other areas and take people through the journey. But gosh, that sounds like so much work, LeTisha. And
It is work. That's why we get paid to do it. If it wasn't work, it'd be done.
We should not talk about price and how much work, much effort here. But in reality, kind of for a head of insights or a head of analytics, let's say, this is a real question, right? Where, if I have 100 points, where is my best bet? It could be capital dollars, whatever, right? Is it in the execution, or is it in the socialization? And when should we think about the impact? The crux of, does all of this really make a difference? Or does it make a difference at the right level? If you think through that kind of lens, what would be some of the best practices, LeTisha, that you could maybe point us towards based on your experiences? Anything that comes to mind that you feel like, oh my God, everyone should do this?
That's a really question. I'm going to be honest with you. I think every organization is a little bit different for what they need. So I would start by really assessing that, because some organizations are really, you can be effective working with a specific champion, and they can help you to basically power through and get the work done. Other organizations are like more consensus driven. So I'm going to say really start with the end in mind, know where you're trying to go, and also figure out who those people are who are going to be fundamentally able to help you get through that journey, because it may not be the same person depending on what part you're at. So start with the end and then kind of like work backwards to design what you want to get to. And then you can actually get started doing the work. I think too often we just jump in and get started and we don't necessarily give that thought in advance. And it doesn't mean that it's something that's going to take a whole bunch of time to figure out. But what it means is just a little bit of like pre-planning can help set you and the team up for success with that respect.
Especially in tech, right? Like the ROI conversation is fairly endemic in the early parts, right? But the intangible or the organizational kind of like I don't know, I don't have the right words for this, but the organizational momentum, especially if it's a change-inducing project, right? That's coming out of this research. I feel like that is much harder to do when you're just getting excited, when you're starting on a project, but it is much more important because most people know that there's an ROI. That's why there was investment in that project, right? That's why we're spending the money or time, effort, whatever. Tell me a little bit about that aspect, kind of the influencing the leaders, giving people the confidence. If there's a head of analytics, let's say, or research, it feels like it's after the researcher has left the room, right? That's when C-suite or next level down start, okay, so what are we going to do? What's the real long-term kind of impact of this? Do we all really buy into it? And is it just for now, short term, or is it really kind of game changing or direction changing with a longer term implication. Do you feel that happens, or do you feel that it's really not very common based on, again, what you experience, what you see day in and day out?
So I think it depends on, I'm going to say it depends. I know it feels very much like a cop out, but I really do feel like it depends. And what I've seen is there are two flavors of conversations that happens. There's the research output conversation, and then there's another layer that happens on top of that, which is like, what does this mean in context of the business? So if the researcher stops at the research output, then there's definitely going to be another conversation without them in the room about the context of the business. But if the researcher does here's the output, and then takes another step into tying it back to the business channel or the challenge or the decision that the leader is looking to make, then now researchers sitting at the table as that discussion is happening. And I think it's really critical to have that, like I said, having the end in mind, because even when that first delivery is happening, you can start to tee up questions that are leading to that next phase and that next level discussion to start getting feedback on what that story should look like. I think that's when I've seen it done well. That's what that looks like. And it also keeps the sponsor engaged, right? Like wanting more, because they really feel like, oh, you get me. You understand what's on my mind right now. Okay, you're leading me to the place that I want to go. And I think that can be sometimes tricky, because sometimes it's more about it's validating what's already in their heads, and that then the conversation becomes so much easier. But then if you're having a conversation where you're trying to change hearts and minds, like it's a little bit trickier, and then maybe you have to step through that a little bit slower or differently than you would if you're already lockstep in what the next step should be.
Absolutely. I feel like this is kind of our philosophy at Imagine If. We promote effort, time, thinking going into this aspect of the project. At the same time, when we're deciding, okay, what is the right methodology? What is the right design? What is the right approach, let's say, right? The technical, executional aspects. And in my experience, it doesn't work all the time, because even when you do the best research, there's just too many other variables out there, right? When kind of rubber hits the road. But a lot of the time, most often, it eases the resistance to the new ideas that are coming out, the new kind of uncomfortable truths that are coming out, or the change of direction that the story is revealing is necessary, and the anxiety that might create within the organization. But it is a lot of work, right? And often I feel like research, analytics, the core groups don't think that way, because they're just more engaged with, like, I gotta solve this problem, as opposed to, okay, what happens after, and how do I get everyone else to see kind of what the truth is, what comes out of it. I feel like it's not like people don't want to do it. Sometimes they might not even have the skill or the awareness or kind of the sensibility that might be needed, but often it's forgotten. It's an afterthought. Like, we did the report. Oh, great. Now we have to do another version for finance. Oh, a ton of questions. Another version for marketing or product or tech or whoever, right? Whatever the geography is. And at the end, they often end up with multiple versions of the story, right? And an organization that's perhaps confused.
Well, I think that's also something too, where you were saying they feel like at the end of the project, they have to do this extra bit. Actually, that should be part of the project. Right. So it's not an extra at the end. That's actually built in. And that's an understanding. That's the next level of the deliverable and what that looks like. I actually want to go back to something that you said earlier, which actually reminded me of something that, you may have heard people talk about, hey, you could have the best strategy in the world, but if you can't execute it, it doesn't mean anything. I think the same thing actually applies to research. You could have the best research in the world, strategy in the world, but if you can't execute on it and it doesn't get implemented, it doesn't really matter. And I think as opposed to, and a lot of people say, I've got to do the best research. Yes, we want to do great research, but I think ultimately what we're trying to get to is like really useful research, right?
I love that. So usefulness, as simple as it sounds, is the kind of the inherent value that's behind impact or within impact, right? ROI is one conversation, one way to think about impact, but real value, real kind of utility, usefulness that comes out of the insights and the recommendation is another way. LeTisha, if you had to kind of think about an ideal scenario where you're advising a group or you're working with a group, let's say, what would be the specific recommendations? Do these things, if it makes sense, obviously, but these are the recommendations that, based on your extensive experience, again, lots of different ways and lots of different projects and initiatives, you would recommend?
Well, I would say definitely start with the end in mind. Know what you're going after. And that sounds like super simple, but sometimes you really have to dig to get to that. Also,
Right.
really understand who your key stakeholders and decision makers are and what they
Right.
really want and what they need, because they'll tell you something, but you've got to dig a little further to understand, okay, if I gave that to you, what are you going to do with it? And if you keep asking that question, then you get a really good sense of, okay, this is what's going to be useful to that person. Right. Because what you're trying to do is tie what outcomes that you could potentially get to what they can actually find, for lack of a better word, useful. And what you produce initially may not be that. And that's why it's important to build in that extra time to then translate it into something that will be useful for your stakeholders and the outcome. And I think the other thing is, like, when you're putting your team together, make sure you've got the right people to do that for the different phases of your project. It's not necessarily just about the different executing the project, but do you have people at the table who can do the translations for the different methodologies, that they're able to kind of pull together a cross-sectional story, that they're able to tell a story to different parts of the business. It may not be the same person that's doing all of that work. It's probably a collection of different people that you're pulling together across your team as a part of that engagement.
Awesome. So basically, plan with the destination in mind. Think about this as early as possible. Think about the people or the stakeholders. Think about the value. What are they going to do? Literally, the utility, the usefulness of this. Some of the other things you said, make sure that you have the right skill set or the right talent to do the socialization kind of components of projects, right? The other thing that you said is the partnership, right? This should not be go away, do this, come back, and then start these things. It should be a kind of a journey together. Sometimes I don't like the word journey, but collaborate together, assuming folks have the appetite or the time, right? Which is a separate talk show. Very good, very good. This has been so exciting. As every single point you brought up, LeTisha's like, oh, that could be a whole separate conversation. But of course, we don't have all the time in the world. Maybe later in the year, we'll get together again and talk a little bit more about this. But it would be a missed opportunity not to ask you these 3 questions, actually, about impact that I ask all of our guests. Okay to ask? It's a little bit more personal.
Oh, sure.
Awesome. So the first one is, tell us one small thing that you do on a daily basis to create positive impact in the world.
This may seem like really small thing, but I think it's just taking time to connect with people as humans. So when you see someone, smile and say hello. You don't know how often people just walk past each other on the street, their neighbors, not even acknowledging that they're there or that they exist. So when you see someone, smile, say hello, wave. It's amazing the number of smiles that come back to me, and it just brightens my day.
Yeah, I love that. Perhaps something that we may have forgotten to do behind all these boxes and screens that we have been for so long. Beyond that one, tell me, LeTisha, one thing that you would encourage others, our listeners, all the different communities of people in our audience, researchers, marketing people, product people, tech, finance. What do you want people to do as a small gesture action to feel like they have a positive impact in the world?
So this is a lesson, something that my daughter has taught me. She's a toddler now, and she doesn't have patience, but I have to have a lot of patience for her. And I know that we're like so busy going through our lives, trying to get through the next thing. And she really forces me to slow down, take time to listen, hear her, acknowledge her, and like actually be with her and enjoy the moment. And I know that sounds like something that's really basic, but I think it goes a really long way in just building just trust and empathy and understanding towards others, just in our busy lives that we tend to just get so caught up and we get lost in with checking our phones and going to the next meeting and trying to get whatever the next thing is done in our homes, right? In our personal lives. And she just reminds me to do that. And I'm just really grateful for it.
And that is absolutely beautiful. I was trying to figure out a way to bring your daughter into this conversation. You did it perfectly. This has been super awesome, super informative and exciting. I feel like I need to go back and write everything down that you inspired with your comments and your answers, LeTisha. And I'm sure our audience is going to feel the same way, which brings me to my third question. So if people wanted to get in touch with you, learn more from you, find you, what would be kind of the best way? Where would you want them to go? Where can we find you if we wanted to?
Yeah, the best way to get in touch with me is on LinkedIn. I'm open to chatting with people, meeting new people, setting up chats for new conversations, informational interviews. There are a couple of people I've met that have started to mentor through LinkedIn, which is great. So I'm open to meeting people through LinkedIn.
Awesome. And we will post the actual kind of link to the profile below too. I'm sure there might be some other LeTisha Shaws, but not this one. This is the special one we have on our guest. Thank you so much, LeTisha, for sharing so generously and insightfully on these otherwise boring questions that I feel like researchers, data people, they don't often talk about because we're so enamored by rigor and shiny sky and all these beautiful kind of amazing things, but often it takes special effort like this one and special people, guests like you, to really kind of transcend that and talk about the bigger kind of how do we make a difference? How do we have impact with all of our work? So I'm super grateful. Thank you so much, LeTisha. And I'm sure we'll do this again in the future.
Thank you so much for having me, Susan. I really enjoyed our conversation.
What is your formula of driving impact within your organization? Impact is the next frontier of research and insights. And it could be a lot easier with the right partner next to you. Reach out to me, Susan Petoyan, on LinkedIn, and let's together discover the impact champion in you. Tune in next week for another episode of All About Impact.